Hi, this is Rachel. It's been a real pleasure for me to read this collection of papers and to share my comments on them with you. And I'm really sorry that it's had to be virtual rather than a face-to-face process, and I've thought a bit about what it means not to be there with you and how important co-presence is. So I very much hope I can join you again another time to talk further about these fascinating questions. I've organised my comments on the papers through some general themes, which I'm going to discuss in turn. They've all been inspired and provoked by the papers, although I may not talk about each paper in detail. These general headings are derived from the reading. So first of all, collaboration. Knowledge production is potentially isolating and a competitive practice. There are push and pull forces at work connecting and dividing us from our colleagues, our research participants, referees, readers and the literature. So communities of interpretation characterised by trust and solidarity are precious, especially those that endure over time, connecting different generations of academics and activists, and providing spaces in which values, methods and voices can be forged and passed on. These kind of collaborations are usually unfunded, and take place in marginal spaces, fuelled as much by friendship as the official academy. And the Centre for Cultural and Feminist Research in Education, Helsinki University, is one of these precious spaces with which I've had the pleasure of being connected over quite a long time, initially through my connection to Janet Holland and her collaboration with Eleanor Helm and Tula Gordon. And I learned an enormous amount from this network, and particularly from the kind of collaborative and cross-cultural research practices that demand engagement with methodological and epistemological questions. So I was really delighted to be able to be part of these symposia, but also to recognise the signature concerns of the group in some of the papers, in all of the papers, but in particularly those written by the Finnish contingent. So I want to start by saying something about framing. In different ways, the four papers draw attention to the ways in which the discursive framing of education and welfare shapes our understanding of research problems. For example, the underachieving student or the vulnerable client, but also the ways in which knowledge is produced in the field itself. And we see this in the kinds of relationships that are possible, for example, between the settled and the mobile, between the professional and the client, but also in the ways in which communication takes place within the field. And a great example of this is shown in the sharing of confidential cases. The papers are all sensitised to these banal practices of the field, drawing on the ideas, for example, of Patty Lather and others to ask what frames are seeing in acute and productive ways. I was fascinated by Francesca Gobo's observations on the symbolic universe of the teacher, for whom ideas of routine and settledness are counterposed with an investment in notions of disruption and mobility associated with traveller families, as if one was not possible without the other. And disrupting these kinds of banal practices is far from simple, as the papers show in different ways, and they may well take us into uncomfortable territory that both we and our participants may prefer to avoid. For me, the kind of heart of this collection of papers and the great achievement is the way in which they denaturalise the ethical in a really productive way. We see this most explicitly in Katarina and Sirpa's problematisation of professional secrecy, which they identify as a core practice underpinning the production of professionalism within the field, but also as something that the researcher is drawn into as a result of governance practices and their very co-presence within the classroom. And we appear to be entering a moment in which ethical consensus associated with knowledge practices of an analogue world are undergoing radical review. The notion that research practices may be moving beyond anonymity is certainly an emerging agenda in the UK social science community, which is coming to terms with the affordances of digitisation. The final report of our recent year-long network on qualitative longitudinal research raises the question, why is anonymity necessary or desirable, and explores the differences between confidentiality and anonymity, as well as exploring which disciplinary contexts and temporal assumptions are part of these commitments. So what, for example, might it mean for people to engage in research without such commitments, and how may it change what research looks like and means? And we know, for example, that there are research traditions that don't have these kinds of commitments. For example, participation action research, documentary historical research, or history research. I've found it useful to think about Mike Savage's history of sociology, of post-war British sociology, where he argues that this particular model of confidentiality and anonymity is the consequence of a moment in the discipline associated with the rise of the survey and the interview, which he suggests abstracted individuals from a physical landscape and generated new ethical concerns, such as the concern to protect anonymity. This, he suggests, controversially, allowed the social sciences to systematically conceal their own tracks. Now, obviously, this version is very much at odds with a kind of critical feminist tradition, which both seeks to gives value to ethical concerns, but also is very committed to explicit methodological accounts. So I think this is an important area of debate that we may well want to contribute to. The important new and emergent ethical questions are also arising around the ownership and control of data and the ethical consequences of documentation. These are not questions that are exclusive to the research process, as practices of self-documentation proliferate and the harvesting of data becomes a new source of value. Researchers could play a special role here, listening out for how this new world order is lived. And examples from these papers include noticing that children characterise their peer cultures as secret, or understanding that teachers operate within a culture of surveillance with powerful logics of allegiance and betrayal into which researchers can be drawn. These are all fragments of evidence about what happens when we try to research, demanding a historical and cross-cultural awareness of the fields in which we seek to understand as our research, as in our fieldwork, but also the history of our tradition and how of our discipline, and how the knowledge produced by research forms part of the fields that we seek to research. The last theme I want to raise is the psychosocial, and the capacity to describe the banal and latent lies at the heart of the psychosocial approach to research, as does the habit of noticing and documenting feelings as evidence. Such feelings are, of course, only a starting place for analysis, riddles that require interrogation, and each of these papers demonstrates a willingness to work in this way. Katerina and Sirpa notice their shared dissatisfaction with anonymity practices. Jenny, Kapuri and colleagues used their feelings of failure to dig deep enough as field workers as evidence of their own uninspected investments in foundationalism. Francesca draws on Deborah Britzman's wise insights about the operations of fantasy within pedagogy as a strategy for decentering the teacher's worldview. And I was very interested in the different methods, the really diverse methods that researchers here use for producing reflexivity, and these range from return to theory, literature and art, but also collaborative and group-based research practices such as participatory action research, and simply talking to and debating with colleagues about about your work and about difficult problems encountered within the field. Critical feminist post-foundational ethnography has a key role to play in making knowledge practices and their effects visible. It constitutes a critical practice in its own right, forging communities of practice and interpretation that have value in securing the continuity and development of traditions, keeping alive the idea of research and the researcher as generative, provocative and catalysing practices. Reading these papers encouraged me that the tradition is live and well. So thank you, and have a good discussion.